All right, we're here to talk about the case for natural fibers today, and we have a really great crew covering most of the natural fibers that are out there, and we're happy to have everybody join us today. Our panelists are Gill Gledhill, who is Director of GGHQ Fashion Intelligence Limited. They are the UK strategic partner to the European Confederation of Flax and Hemp. Hello, Gill.
Hello, good morning.
Sarah Schlenger joins us from the West Coast. She is R&D Commercialization Manager for the Americas for Woolmark. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Jennifer. Hi, everyone.
And Marc Lewkowitz, who is President and CEO of Supima. Hi, Marc.
Good morning, Jennifer. Morning, Sarah. Morning, Jill.
Okay, so let's get going. And Jill, I'm going to start with you. Can you just tell us about the European Confederation of Flax and Hemp? What's it do? Who are its members? I assume it's a membership organization.
It is, exactly. Well, really glad to be here to tell you more about it. CLC, as we call it, is the Confederation of European Flax and Hemp, and it was founded in 1951 to be the spokesperson for 10,000 European companies. And it oversees the fibers development, the flax fiber development from plant to finished product. So it has many different roles. They like to incite reflection. They offer practical assistance and support along the entire supply chain. So whether you are a producer or you're actually selling it, we offer the tools for you to help the supply chain thrive. There's a lot of research and development. We're involved in also the cultural aspect of flax in our lives. And recently, CLC has sponsored some big exhibitions at museums in London and in Paris, because flax and linen has been a part of our civilization right from year dot. So it's really exciting to be able to explore that and to see how the world's most ancient fiber is also its most relevant today in terms of sustainability and being good for the planet. It's so natural. It's come full circle.
Okay. Sarah, I think a lot of us as consumers are familiar with the Woolmark logo, but may not know exactly what Woolmark is and how the organization works. Could you kind of give us the brief on that?
Yeah, it's kind of unique and a little bit complicated. So the Woolmark company is a subsidiary of Australian Wool Innovation, AWI. And Australian Wool Innovation is funded by 60,000 Australian wool growers. It's a not-for-profit. We invest those funds as the Woolmark company into research and development and marketing. And that's right across the supply chain for wool. So from the farm all the way to retailers. We spend about 40% of those funds on R&D, both on farm, so for land improvements, dealing with drought, dealing with animal husbandry, improving health of your flock, et cetera, to R&D in the supply chain. So working with mills, spinners, early stage processors to improve those processes, whether making them more sustainable or advancing them technologically. And then on the marketing front, that's about where 60% of our funds go. And that's working directly with retailers and brands to have that consumer-facing messaging about wool and its benefits and properties be prominent in their marketing strategy. We also have the licensing program, our Woolmark license, the logo that you had mentioned, Jennifer, that's been around since, I think it's 1954. It's been applied to more than 5 billion products, both apparel and home textiles, and it's still gaining traction today. We actually just relaunched it in January with some new marketing content and just explaining the meaning behind the mark. So I also help administer that program for the Woolmark company, quality assurance mark, also assuring fiber content. Okay.
And Marc, I hope most of our audience is familiar with Supima. A question kind of for all three of you, but I'm going to start with you, Marc, is what do you see the trajectory in the last year or two and looking ahead into this year into the adoption of natural fibers, the use of natural fibers in the along the companies you guys work with?
Thanks, Jennifer. The value of natural fiber is unique relative to the entire fiber spectrum. When you're talking about natural fibers, it's coming from natural resources. So the impact of that in terms of the communities, the growers, the extended community that services the growers, the logistics, the transportation, the manufacturing, it engages a massive amount of people, supports rural communities. So there's benefits in terms of getting money back into developing regions and supporting those. So it comes with a lot of intrinsic benefits as opposed to just supporting, massive investments in technology to make other technical fibers. So, that's one of the unique benefits when brands look towards sustainability and responsibility and authenticity is what does that mean in terms of their fiber selection processes? Can they choose a fiber that has a more salient and reasonable approach to supporting community, the people that are also going to be the buyers of your product? And how do you engage in that conversation? So what we've seen, even before the pandemic hit, we saw already a pickup in terms of natural fiber adoption and appreciation. And now that we've gotten into this global pandemic with the workspace changing and how people are working and the selection of clothes that they're choosing, that's changed. And because people are at home, their home is getting makeovers too. So they're reapproaching of, well, I'm living in this environment, or I'm using this chair more, or my bed is a place I'm actually spending some time with my laptop open and doing something. So they're making investments and making more informed choices of trying to be comfortable and being aware of what they're sourcing.
Yeah. Jill, what are you seeing from your perspective?
Absolutely agree with Marc. I think that the time we've had at home has made us focus very much more on what we surround ourselves with, what we're wearing, how we live, and also the time to do the research into what it is that we're purchasing, whether that be online or in store when we can access stores. So yes, I think that we have an absolutely informed consumer audience who's just hungry for information and is really, I think we've all taken a lot of solace in nature through the pandemic. And so we want to support our natural environment. By doing so, we can think about, well, what happens at the end of life of so many products, and in our biodiversity of the planet around us. I think the Blue Planet program wakened many people up to the idea of plastic waste and what goes into the ocean. And so with natural fibers, flax and linen, they're completely biodegradable at end of life, which is so vital. It's such a horrible feeling when you sort of pick up a piece of polyester, think this is going to be around in its form for 200 years or more. Whereas if you spend the time and maybe a little more on something which is natural, it's something that you can pass on to the next generation with love and a real sense of awe and wonder in the products that you have, and just cherish what's around you a little bit more. I think less about disposability and more about that just engendering a sense of enriching our lives.
Yeah. It's interesting. You mentioned end of life for a product, and certainly in the sustainability discussions in the textiles world and the home textiles in particular, sustainability has really gained a lot of traction. The end of life thing is in the conversation. I'm just curious for the three of you. I mean, what's the pull on that, or what do you see in the companies you're working with? Are they making much of a case about that aspect of it in their natural fiber products, or is that still really kind of down the list? I mean, do you want to take that one first, Sarah?
Yeah, sure, Jill or Jennifer. And Jill kind of alluded to the microplastic problem, and I admittedly work more with the apparel industry than I do with the interiors industry. And the microplastic issue is really driving specifically outdoor brands, and then following that, sports brands. to natural fiber solutions, which, you know, think about an outerwear coat is so typically a synthetic, and they're really trying to reinvent that product specifically to contain natural fibers and make a biodegradable claim, and not be responsible for microplastics in terrestrial and marine environments. So that is really, really driving the innovation in the apparel industry right now, like I said, specifically for outdoor brands. So yeah, it's definitely moving the needle.
Though I will say, if within the home textiles world, if there's one sector where have seen it jump out ahead of others, it's in the soft flooring space. It's in the area rugs and broadloom carpet, is where some of the U.S. manufacturers have been particularly active in saying we're going to recycle because we can take this stuff back in and it's not going to fill landfill, which I think is a really good thing. Jill, you were talking about the longevity, the long history of flax. I'm curious about technically what is considered European flax.
Well, in the flax fields that produce European flax are in a really beautiful area of countryside from Caen in northern France all the way up to Amsterdam. So it's the belt along the English Channel, if you can picture that. And from a UK perspective, when I'm speaking to retailers there, it's very local. So it's seen as our local fiber. It's also European fiber, and it's a fiber of European origin. So the European flax certification means that the flax fiber in whatever product has been grown in Europe and it's certified. And that gives you assurance in terms of social responsibility as well as skills and all the environmental assurances there. That the flax can be processed elsewhere in the world, but you will have the assurance of the European flax certification. Masters of Linen is our second certification, which means that the products have been fully manufactured from plant all the way to finished product within Europe.
Okay. Now, we also have seen in some spaces in the United States, and I'm again talking about home textiles particularly, where the broader call out is, you know, European linen. And then when you look at the tag, it says, you know, made in, name your country that's not in Europe, from flax grown in Europe. Is that considered kind of like a problem, a no-no, a good thing? No,
that's absolutely fine. That's great. We fully support European flax. And actually, the European Union is the #1 exporter of flax. 70% of the flax grown there is exported to the international market. So we're very happy for it to be produced elsewhere. It says quality assurance.
Okay. All right. So I always wonder about that, if it's considered sort of false advertising or it's a good thing that it's getting into the supply chain and
absolutely. I think the specificity in that is that it's European flax, and that we can't put a country label on where it comes from, because the flax crops, the bales are blended like a very fine wine or cognac. You don't have just the flax from one harvest being used from one field, one country. It's blended across many different harvests, and can be, in order to achieve consistency and the quality and the yarn type. So yeah, that's what I would say on that. So if you see it's a country from a particular country, that isn't quite right. It should be European flax, as it's really homogenized across different harvests in different countries to produce one very high quality yarn or product.
Okay. And I'm also wondering for all three of you, and I'll start with you first, Marc, kind of what's our supply situation right now as we're looking to the next year or two?
Yeah, so good question, Jennifer. Thanks. Supply is always limited. Supima is a small exclusive portion of cotton that's grown in the U.S. We represent typically around approximately 3%, but it can vary from around 2%, maybe up to about 6% on an annual basis, depending on U.S. cotton production. This year we saw a slightly smaller production, and just due to weather conditions, there's been less rain. Here in Arizona, we received our first rain in over a year 2 weeks ago. So those affect the availability of just water. All American Pima is grown on irrigation, which allows it to be managed to the most efficient and sustainable practices possible by allowing delivery of the water when it's needed. But you need a collection system, and that's usually from the rain up in the mountains and the snowpack as they slowly melt in the spring, and allowing that to be managed and controlled and delivered to the farming communities as they need it. The other issue is when COVID started, we ended up with a scenario where brands and retailers all became panicked with regards to sourcing. And that introduces challenges into the supply chain. So we have extenuating challenges from the reduction of orders from the beginning to the rollout of orders, the change in how orders are being placed from larger program orders to now small replenishment order programs. And now as demand is slowly coming back, as the brands and retailers are finding ways of approaching their product mix and selling it in a virtual online market as opposed to the physical stores, that's changing the mix and how things are changed. So there's been some supply delivery challenges in terms of getting cotton through the supply chain. So we find sticking points throughout, and because of next year's weather and where prices were at near historical lows this past year, we'll likely see another small reduction in production. So again, all of that is manageable though through just good communication, understanding what your demand matrix looks like and what you'll need, and communicating that back to the supply chain allows you to mitigate a lot of those challenges or concerns that might arise.
Okay, and Sarah, I see you shaking your head a lot, nodding a lot. And the situation with wool is a little different because it's not a crop, but it's still an agricultural based. What is the supply-demand situation in wool?
And just like Marc said, weather, climate, this affects the way any agricultural products production and yield provides in a given year. Australia grows 75% of the world's total amount of wool, and then closer to 90% when we're looking at fine wool, and that's measured in microns. So fine wool is considered under 21.5 micron. So really, as the stakeholder down there in Australia, I would say supply is steady. It dipped last year due to rainfall, but is projected to recover. Our export market, and Gill touched on this again, the majority of the wool is grown in Australia, but it's not processed in Australia. So the largest export market for Australian wool is China, because they early stage process it in China. So about 85% of Australian wool goes to China first before it's sent to Italy for spinning or remains in China for spinning and for consumer. The real demand that we're seeing for wool that the supply hasn't really caught up to is in traceable wool, certified, traceable for and certified for animal welfare. So there's a really large demand for that, and for specific wool types, specific microns, specific avenue.
Who does the certification on those things?
So I'd say there's probably like 3 major certification companies out there doing it, but in total there's probably 7 or 8.
Are there 1 or 2 standards that are considered like these are standards to?
Yeah, so Textile Exchange has the responsible wool standard that's quite popular and high demand. There's also Nativa, which is another wool standard for welfare and traceability that companies are accepting as a certification. So basically just knowing the supply chain and knowing all the way back to the grower, really, to have confidence that that product is causing no harm to environment or to animal. So that demand is definitely growing, and the industry is looking to catch up to supply it because it does come at a premium. So it's a good opportunity for wool growers and for the supply chain to add value through being part of those certification schemes.
Okay, and Jill, I'm going to ask you to touch on supply, and then we have a question specific to flax and linen, and then we have another question that's kind of for everybody. So take it away.
Yeah, as Sarah and Marc have said, as a natural product, as a crop, it is the outcome of the crop annually really is determined by the weather. The yield is determined by rainfall, because flax, it doesn't require any other irrigation. It's just from the natural rainfall in that band in Northern Europe. So yes, last year we had a very dry May. The seeds would have been sown around March. It takes 100 days for the plants to grow. So if there is a sort of stop in the rainfall, then that will affect the overall height of the crop. However, the stocks are still significant, and so there's no issue in terms of consistency and continuity in terms of product availability.
Okay, and here's the question that's specific to: do flax and linen require any special technology for spinning yarns, both blended or exclusive? And can you speak to wet spinning?
I'll say this: I'm not a spinning expert. I'm actually trained as a weaver myself, so I wouldn't hazard too much on that. But yes, you do need specific equipment for linen spinning. I think it's more about keeping the fibers separate more than a separate machine. But on that, I'd have to come back to you with some expert advice from my colleagues if you want more info.
Okay, thank you. And then there's a question for the whole panel, and Marc, I'm going to ask you to kick it off. And I'm not sure if we have any data that can address it, but we'll see what everyone's impressions are. Can you talk about consumer demand for natural fibers versus synthetic, particularly for products like, upholstered furniture, which are very often made largely with polyester fabrics?
Yeah.
Any anecdotal point of view on this?
Yeah, I don't really have any, relevant talking points other than we are all aware that the fabrics for home goods generally, for furniture, carpets tend to be all synthetic fibers for the lion's share. You get into the luxury space, and then you do see the natural fibers coming in, but for commodity items, it's all going to be synthetics just because of price points, volume availability, lack of consumer education is part of it. Misunderstanding of some of the facts relative to this synthetics versus natural fibers is always a part of that conversation. It's a big uphill battle for all the natural fibers to gain more of a foothold within the furniture segment, let's say, even in rugs. There are some interesting movements. There's Benny Rugs, for example. They were doing some handmade rugs out of Africa, made out of natural wool, natural dyed. So you're beginning to see some interesting, entrepreneurship come into the space where they're changing the models, and because of the ability of having an online platform, they can do so aggressively, with managing their supply chain very efficiently. But it's not something you can go to a store and you can pick up today. So that consumer demand, that instant gratification, generally is not something that is going to be there with natural fibers, because it's something you either have to order, it's specially made, it's not as readily available because it's more of a luxury good, so the unit volume isn't there. Those will tend to be the issues that at least we get to see from our cotton side of things in that segment.
Well, Jill, you and Marc, before we went live, I overheard you talking about the fact that if you're advocating for natural fibers, something along the lines of don't spend too much of your time talking about what's wrong potentially or off or with synthetics, but focus more
On the
on
benefits.
of what's right, right?
Exactly. Well, for flax, linen in the home is just a natural fit. You can use it in so many different ways. You can have it as bedding, you can have it as upholstery, for tabletop, for drapes, and it's extremely hard wearing. So without any blends necessary. I mean, if it's on a sofa, for instance, you could, if you have loose covers, you can take them off and put them in the washing machine. And it washes incredibly well, and flax linen takes color extremely well, so you're not going to be worried about it becoming faded over time. And there's so many different styles available also, so you might want a crisp look or a more rustic look. It's all available to you and to the designers working in linen. So I'd say actually the easy care nature of using flax linen in your home, it really needs to be highlighted by retailers to maybe express why a consumer might be spending a little more, that you might spend a little bit more on this, but it's going to last incredibly well. And actually linen gets better with age and use. It gets softer, it has a luster of its own. And for white linens, you can wash them on high and bedding, and it's hypoallergenic. It's breathable to sleep in. It's the most delightful feeling, and it actually helps you to have a better night's sleep, because when you're in that REM period and your body isn't moving, you're not very good at thermoregulating. But a linen sheet will do it for you. It breathes, and actually the combination of a linen sheet and a wool blanket is just perfection to sleep under in all temperatures. So it's the benefits that need to be highlighted more.
Yeah, I know the common misperception in the United States that nobody can seem to shake is that wool is only for winter, right? We actually have a very specific question about wool. So specific, I don't know if you're going to be able to answer it, Sarah, but I'm going to throw it at you anyway. And then we have a couple more general questions. So this is from Penelope, who actually grows sheep in Alberta. She is looking at Icelandic sheep as to climate well-being and husbandry of the sheep in northern climes, plus wool production. Do you know whether Icelandic sheep is a good producer of wool? And if you don't, maybe you know a resource that might be able to answer that question.
I cannot answer that specifically, but I can give some general knowledge on wool and the different breeds of sheep that grow it. There's over 100 breeds of sheep. Wool fiber is keratin based, just like human hair. So as the sheep breed changes, the physical nature of the wool changes, the length of the wool, the crimp of the wool, the fineness of the wool. So we kind of classify wool as fine, medium, and broad. So Icelandic sheep would, and I'm making some assumption here, but I think it's going to be a broader wool, a mid to a broader wool, which means it's going to be quite durable and maybe not something you'd want next to your skin, but something that would do really well in carpeting and rugs and insulative purposes, and just where a lot of high durability is needed. It probably felts pretty well, if I had to guess, which is something unique to the wool fiber. Most natural fibers don't felt due to the scale structure of the keratin cuticle is why wool fibers felt, just like human hair can felt as well. It's called dreadlocks is what human hair felting is. So I think Icelandic sheep, listen, all wool is great. Chemically, all wool acts the same. It all absorbs a third of its weight in moisture vapor, which is really incomparable to any other fiber in existence. So chemically, they all act the same. It's just physical attributes that are going to be a bit different and lend wool to different purposes. You're not going to use Icelandic wool in an Italian suiting, but for interiors, it might have a good home.
Okay. Here's another question that's sort of general probably more cotton and flax. Interested to know more about inputs, both from the growing side as well as the processing side of these fibers, fertilizer and pest control, chemical fiber modifications in spinning or weaving, as well as finishes, and how does all of this relate to overall sustainability? Marc, do you want to grab that one first?
Yeah, so that's a full-on question
That's
with a
a
whole
soup to nuts.
number of different things. So, when we talk about cotton, we have to realize 80% of the world's natural fibers are cotton, right? So it's a massive crop that's grown around the world in many different environments, geographical regions, economic systems, et cetera. So the practices vary dramatically. From Supima's standpoint, it's only grown in the US and only grown in 4 states of California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. These are arguably the most regulated growing environments for cotton anywhere in the world. When you look at the regulations as they apply to fertilizer and pesticides, many of those that are allowed to be used in the rest of the world have been banned in the US more than 20 years ago. Also, those that are allowed to be used are only allowed to be used at 1/10 of the threshold level where it's considered a danger to humans. So the controls and requirements that are in place are federally, locally, statewide, all are mandated, and the growers are all reported to report this information. So that's unique to the US in general, specifically to Supima growers. So that applies to whether it's fertilizer or pest controls. And then when you're talking about chemical modification of fiber, there's not so much in terms of chemical modification other than, let's say, mercerizing or gassing. Those are processes that will happen in the finishing processes, the dyeing process, the softeners that could be added, silicone. Those are things that are generally applied in the finishing process, not on the growing side. The growing is just the natural fiber itself. The ginning is just separation of the fiber from the seed and the leaf content. So there is nothing happening on the agricultural side. The rest happens downstream. Now, when you talk about sustainability, man, it's a word that's difficult to answer unitarily with regards to specific things, because sustainability should incorporate the entire broad system that is engaged in taking the product from the beginning all the way to the finished product. Includes logistics, transportation, infrastructure, all of those things. So I think it behooves, the entire industry, the entire fiber spectrum to talk knowledgeably and authentically, and as Jill was saying about, having the protocols and systems in place to produce the best practices for flax and linen, and the same thing with Sarah in terms of the practices that are used in Australia for growing wool under the most responsible farming practices. It's the same, for Supima and cotton in general, where it really depends upon us about being authentic about the way we approach the farming process and sharing that information. Here in the US, we have the US Cotton Trust Protocol, which is a system that's being put into place that allows the entire industry to track all that data, and that will be rolled up into a national database. So it'll actually show measurable differences over time of the meaningful impacts that are derived out of those changes in farming practices. So those are all part of that sustainability question. So it's difficult to answer sustainability as a simple green check or a simple answer to that. It really takes a deeper dive into the conversation of what are specifically the greater challenges for each person or group or company in the supply chain. And from the brand retail's perspective, what is it that they're trying to accomplish? What can you influence? What can you manage? What do you know about your supply chain? And how can you engage with the supply chain to be responsible and to try and influence small changes that over time become, responsible and meaningful?
Okay, great. I've actually got, yeah, you want to go?
For flax, there are very few inputs. And as I mentioned before, the only water required to grow it is rainwater that falls naturally. I think that there's very little that needs to go into it, and the actual process of extracting the fiber is done completely mechanically. There are no chemicals used in that. It's such a natural process that you basically take the straw and beat it so that the shives come out, and then you extract the fiber from that. And every part of the plant can be used, so there's zero waste. Which, you know, it's a really exciting process. I mean, even the dust that comes out of the process can be used as fertilizer and is used. So in terms of the inputs, there are very few chemicals used in growing flax at all, and it's grown as a rotation crop, which actually benefits the soil. So it's grown every 7 years, with alternating with wheat, beets, and other crops, so that it gives back to the soil. Flax has incredibly long roots, which help to aerate the soil and improve soil quality over time. So in terms of what's required, I mean, the farmers who are growing the food crops following the flax, you know, they really are taking very good care of their land to make sure that it's treated with as much respect as possible, giving more back to the environment than takes away. And it also creates more biodiversity in having a rotation crop.
Okay, and there are two quick questions for you. Where would someone find marketing material on sleep quality vis-a-vis linen sheeting?
It's all open source, europeanflax.com. All the information is there. If there's anything I can steer somebody to, I'm very happy to speak with them afterwards.
Okay, and this may also be the same answer. What testing can be done to substantiate claims of breathability and hypoallergenic on linen?
It's all third-party verified, and the studies are available to read through the website. So I'm very happy to share that. It's europeanflax.com. It was actually the on sleep study that was done by the University of Milan.
Okay, great. So that's all on the site. Sarah, I know that when I was on the Woolmark site recently, I saw some highlights from a recent study at the University of Sydney that I don't know if you're very familiar with it, about wool and sleep. And do you know what some of the highlights of that were?
Yeah, there's been 3 studies, I think, from the University of Sydney around sleep. One was conducted probably like 15 years ago, and it was, I believe, focused on REM cycles and can, you know, laying under a wool duvet improve sleep. And it was found that your REM cycle would increase by like 3 minutes, giving you an overall 27 minutes of better quality deep sleep. And then the most recent one was about the onset of sleep. And that was done in wool sleepwear. So actually wearing jersey knitted wool pajamas. And they found that in just 12 minutes compared to a regular 22, average 27 minutes, a person was able to fall asleep faster in wool than polyester or cotton, were the other 2 fibers studied. And then another research, some research that was published recently was from the Allergy Standards Limited. They officially recognized merino wool bedding products as asthma and allergy friendly. So that was debunking a huge myth that, you know, I'm allergic to wool. In fact, wool is hypoallergenic. So it was great to get that certification from them. And that is all available on woolmark.com. There's links to the research papers on woolmark.com if you'd like to reference those in your marketing. And if you want any help from Woolmark, they do invest in that type of marketing. So.
Okay, great. Thanks. Got another question. There seems to be a focus on imported fibers here. Well, except for Supima, guys, which is all grown in the United States. Could you speak to domestic growth and production of natural fibers? Also, are European linen and Australian wool superior to those fibers produced in the US? Is it really just a matter of one part of the world has really specialized in it, or is there some better quality?
I think, yes, you've answered it. I think the history and the heritage of growing in a particular area, I think, there is the understanding, we call it the know-how of it is passed on from generation to generation. So I think there's also the equipment needed. You do need specific harvesting equipment for flax, because the roots, it's not cut, it's pulled up from the earth when it's harvested. And so you need a machine to do that. And then it's retted, where the retted, again, no chemicals needed in that process, where the flax is tipped on its side in the field. And through moisture, bacteria, the hard outside it starts to break down, and the glues that hold the fibers together start to break down, which is the retting process. And then that's flipped from one side to the other. So you need a machine to do this to that, and then to bale it. And then, of course, you have the scutching equipment, which is the process of extracting the fiber and all of the different elements within the flax itself to turn it into long fibers, short fibers, the seeds, and the shives, and all the other elements. So, yes, you need specific equipment that it takes significant investment, as well as the skills to do this. And, of course, you need the right environment in which to grow it. So putting all that together, this is why we have this area of specificity in Europe, where we grow it and do it at a very high level and produce an excellent product.
Can I just ask you quickly about the hemp portion of it, which I assume is...
Sorry, the what portion?
Hemp, because the association is flax and
hemp. Oh, hemp, yes, sorry.
I certainly know in the United States, hemp is something that's just starting to get going, and really mostly, I think, at this point for CBD oil and medical marijuana and whatnot. But what's the trajectory of hemp in Europe?
Well, currently the production of textile grade long hemp fiber is very limited in Europe. It's less than 5,000 tons of yarn versus 130,000 tons of linen yarn. So the long fiber of hemp is largely produced and spun in Asia currently. The European hemp production of hemp is really a paper grade. So for building materials, paper, twine, things like that. So it's not really suitable for spinning for clothing or for textiles, except for open end spinning in a cotton hemp blend. So some European hemp producers are looking at growing and developing methods and machines for achieving sort of more of a textile grade long hemp fiber, but it's still an artisanal level right now.
Okay. And then thanks for letting me kind of do that sidestep, because Sarah, I wanted to get back to you with that question we had before. Why isn't anybody raising sheep in the United States, or not enough of them? Is it as the situation with flax, that it's tradition, it's environmental? I mean, what's the situation with domestic production?
There are quite a few sheep raised in the United States, but the majority of those sheep are raised for meat and not for wool. So they're bigger sheep. They have a larger body, larger carcass weight, and used for lamb meat. Growing or raising wool sheep requires a pretty specific climate and a lot of space, because you're grazing these sheep for their lifetime. You're shearing them annually. You're making sure they have lambs every year, so their genetics, the fine wool genetics, are carried through the flock, carried through that farm. So the average farm size in the United States is around 450 acres, whereas in Australia, it's closer to 4,000 acres.
Wow.
Because these farms are, they're usually dual purpose. So they're raising sheep, and they also might be cultivating if they're in the proper area of the country. But sheep aren't fed out grain. These merino sheep, they graze on paddocks of grass, and they also forage too. So they need quite a bit of land space to do that. The average flock is around, I think it's 10,000 sheep. So you've got quite a few animals. It costs quite a bit to shear them, so you need a lot of them to be able to make that profit as a as a wool grower. And we just don't have that kind of land space. And then also the predators are a threat to sheep. And in Australia, they have wild dogs, dingoes that are a threat, and they have to control that. But here in the US, we have bears and mountain lions and coyotes and wolves and all sorts of things that just really prefer a meal of lamb, you know? So there's that extra threat too to take into consideration when keeping and raising live animals.
Okay.
You know, there's other challenge I would add too. You know, there's a small company called Duckworth out of Colorado that does some domestic wool, but the capacity to process, you know, here in the US, we've lost a lot of our textile capacity. You know, so for us, for example, for Supima, 90% of our cotton is exported. You know, most of the US cotton in general is exported. The amount of textile capacity here, just because of general costs, have you know, seen, you know, brands and retailers look overseas for sourcing. So there is little support for the agricultural community in the US for domestically sourced and made products. You know, again, that's something that can be addressed with messaging and responsible aspects, you know, and relationships with the brands and retailers that, you know, we can address. But, you know, it's just a fundamental fact that, you know, we can't even process it on the, you know, on the wool side in any capacity.
Excellent point. Excellent point. And that's, you know, so often the case with other things when people start talking about why aren't we doing more domestically? We just don't have the infrastructure and probably couldn't get financing for that infrastructure if you wanted to put it into place, right?
The labor, you know, the skilled labor to run the machinery, you know, even in the cotton spinning that's here, finding capable, knowledgeable people that have experience, understand the machinery, can manage and run it efficiently to increase efficiencies of the operation so that there's less seconds or dropouts. It's getting really, really hard for those mills that exist today to keep people employed or to bring in younger people to learn the trade. They're just not interested. They're not getting paid enough.
Yeah. Okay. Another question. The International Down and Feather Bureau released a life cycle assessment study it had commissioned, which showed a very significant difference between down insulation versus man-made fibers, especially in terms of sustainability, in favor of down in all cases except water usage. Are there any naturally grown fibers which have insulation performance that can perform near down or polyester products? And if so, have similar relative sustainability studies been done that you know of? And the answer from me is I have no idea, but maybe you guys do.
Yeah, I can speak to that, Jennifer. So wool has great insulation properties. That's because wool has a crimp, a natural occurring physical crimp. And when you twist wool fibers together or felt them together, it forms air pockets, and air pockets insulate. Wool also has the ability to absorb moisture vapor, creating an environment that has less moisture in it and can be more thermally regulated. And it is often used as insulation in homes, in apparel, in furniture, because of these factors. Down does not deal with moisture well at all. In fact, it can mold. It's not washable, whereas wool can be washable and deals well with the moisture. So that's another reason for insulation and uses for the wool fiber. Warmth to weight ratios are important to consider, especially if you're going to be wearing wool. Wool is heavier than down. Most things are heavier than down, but you can still get a warmth to weight ratio that's acceptable. You're just going to have to accept that wool does way more. So a wool duvet compared to a down duvet is going to be a bit heavier to get that same insulative property. And then compared to polyfill, you can actually use wool at 25% less weight to still get the same insulative properties. So polyfill, it's a benefit on both sides, warmth to weight ratio.
Okay. So it's a little heavier in a duvet. Just call it a wool weighted blanket. It'll fly right off the shelf.
Right. People love those weighted blankets. So I guess it does tick that box.
And one more quick wool related question. So what happens to the wool from sheep who are raised for meat? Is that
Yeah,
just not a good quality wool?
but it's a byproduct, and there's not really a market for it in the US. There's wool pools, and I'm going to admit, I can't speak to the US market that well. I work for the Australian wool industry, but I do have a little bit of experience. I talked to ASI, who's the same sort of regulating sheep and wool body here in the US as AWI is in Australia. But yeah, there's got to be a market for it. And wool is processed by its length. Whether it's woolen spun or worsted spun is going to be determined by its staple length. So it's really quite effective in the shearing shed if you're sorting that wool before it even gets into the manufacturing and processing supply chain. That's not happening in a shearing shed where wool isn't the product, because it does take human input and skill to manage the wool clip on farm. So if that wool is not being sorted on farm to be processed, then it's of a cost advantage just to, bury it, because it's going to biodegrade. So bury it, put it on your gardens, put it out in your field, because you're going to benefit from it in a different way than entering up industrial textile processing supply chain.
Okay, thank you. Marc, a question for you. When and where might we hear Marc's updated global and US centric projections on the cotton market, pricing, quality, and distribution?
Well, thanks for the question. Lots to cover in there, so I'll try and keep it simple. Prices are recovering for cotton, generally speaking, across the board. Specifically on Supima, prices have recovered dramatically over the last year, already back to more traditional levels that we'd seen over the last 5 years. Demand for cotton has also been recovering. There's become better logistics in terms of distribution of cotton in raw form, in fiber form, in yarns and fabrics, etc. So we expect the US production probably to be a little bit smaller again this year, including Supima. Global supplies of cotton are still robust. There's plenty of cotton to go around from Supima's standpoint. We will sell out of this year's crop. I expect the ending stocks to be 0 this year, which will put a little bit more pressure on next year, which would likely, based on basic supply and demand mechanics, mean that prices should go higher. But you never know, because whatever happens with the market and how things develop with the pandemic. In terms of qualities are always improving here in the US. We continuously work on breeding and improving the varieties. Predominantly, there's about 14 Supima varieties, of which the bulk is grown with 3 or 4 every single year. But there are always new varieties rolled out, and those varieties take typically from 5 to 12 years to create. The same thing with US cotton in general. There are some newer, longer staple varieties of cotton being developed in the US on an upland side, so that'll push into that kind of long staple category, whereas Supima is still the largest extra long staple cotton variety produced in the world. So the largest production of ELS cotton still persists here in the US.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about, can we speak to UV stability for home textiles on fibers without protective finishes? I don't know if that is something that comes into play in the flax world at all.
Well, it's an interesting subject. I'm wondering about, it will definitely have an issue about the coloring, how it's been treated, if it's been bleached or unbleached or dyed, or what dye method has been used. So I think it's quite a big subject. Again, I don't have a specific answer on it. If there's something particular the questioner would like to know, I'd be happy to get the information for you.
And I would add on the UV side, for generally, I think this would apply to all natural fibers relative to the synthetics. UV light, sunlight is part of the biodegrading process. It is a partial of the natural process of allowing products to become biodegradable. So the resistance of natural fibers in general to strong UV light or persistent UV light is probably not the ideal environment for those fibers to be used in. You're not going to find it in outdoor patio furniture coverings. That generally is not going to be the
or without
suitable.
some kind of protective finish on it.
Yeah, and typically that's what we'll find is, specifically in cotton, if it's going to be in somewhere that's going to be a light sensitive area, it's going to have a UV protective finish, a treatment on it of some sort.
Yeah, we've seen some very high-end, sorry to interrupt Sarah, we've seen some very high-end furnishing fabrics for outdoor furniture produced, but they're very technical blends using linen and some synthetics to give it a bit more hard-wearing finish.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So-
I'm going to say that wool has a UV protectant rating of close to 40, just naturally occurring. So it is pretty resistant to fading, color fading, and actually covalently bonds with reactive and acid dyes in the cortex of the fiber. It also has a protective coating on the keratin that makes it UV durable as well. So it withstands color loss pretty well if it's dyed properly, just as was mentioned earlier.
So we've just got a couple of minutes left. I wondered if we could, for each of the fibers that you're involved with, talk about, and you guys are working with companies that are making the end products, what are some of the marketing messages that you're seeing these companies using, and what do they think is resonating with their consumers in terms of these fibers and the attributes that they want to communicate with them?
I think that health and wellness is big in marketing messages right now, and natural fibers really lend themselves to that story. So wool inhibits bacteria, fungus, dust mites. So it's a really great choice for people who are suffering allergy or breathing conditions, or just naturally want to purify their home as an active fiber. Wool is working to do that and can do so in carpets for up to 30 years.
Really?
So I think that that line of messaging is really resonating, and it's very relevant today.
Okay. Jill, what messaging are you seeing around flax and linen?
Well, it really depends on the end consumer. We run the I Love Linen campaign and this is a campaign that's been running in France, Italy, and the UK for the last 4 years. And we speak with retailers and ask them what's going to work for your customer. You know them best. What are the messages that inspire them? Ultimately, I think the beauty of flax, the diversity and the surprising nature of linen is something that we talk about quite a lot. This is a linen top. You probably wouldn't think about it. You can have a flax surfboard. You can have flax composites can be used as a very light, sound absorbing element within home building. It's also extremely easy care, which I think some people might think, I've got to get the iron out if I'm going to buy some linen. No, pre-wash linen, no ironing required. Stick it in the machine, tumble dry it or air dry it. It's good to go. You don't need to do anything with that. And ultimately, it's really good for the planet. It's a plant. It's totally biodegradable. It's a lovely thing, and it's long lasting. That's the thing. The durability, the long lasting, it's really good value for money. You're going to invest in something. You're going to have many years of pleasure with, and it's going to just improve with age. It doesn't get better than that, really.
Okay, Marc, I'm going to give the final word to you.
Well, thank you. And I would reiterate Jill's points in terms of it really depends on our partners. The messaging is really customized towards what the brand partner, retail partner is really trying to get across or convey in terms of their choice of why they're using the fiber. For us, it usually comes down to responsibility, knowledge. We have authenticity. Supima is the first branded fiber that has origin verification through forensic science that can authenticate the fiber back to the point where it's grown. So at any point in the supply chain, we can prove and demonstrate that the fiber is grown from a specific area. We're working with Caring Group that are using organic Supima from one particular farm, and they can prove that their product comes from that one farm. By having authenticity at an origin level, you actually have the ability to then talk knowledgeably and responsibly about the sustainability aspects that grow into the farming operations in that area where the cotton is grown. So, those tangible assets and values are, kind of that responsible messaging, but every brand has their own little niche in terms of how they want to convey that, so it becomes, a responsibility in terms of using, a natural fiber, or that it's a biodegradable, or that it have less impact on the environment, or that it's supporting, agricultural rural communities. Those are all very different conversations. And you can't package that into one message for a consumer. It's impossible. I mean, to get a consumer's attention, you have to have one or two points that become the salient messages. So what we have to do as industry people is be responsive to those requests and requirements from those partners.
Great. Thank you all for your time. Thank you to our audience for all the great questions. Sorry we couldn't get to every single one of them, but some great food for thought. And we will see you next month. We'll be announcing our next seminar topic very soon, so keep your eyes peeled. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. Good talk today.
Thank you,
Thank
Jennifer.
you, everyone. All the best.